David Wallace-Wells, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here. Good to talk to you.
So you have written the most best-selling or one of the most best-selling books about climate change. Very simply, why should we be really concerned about climate change in your opinion?
Well, just today, where the climate seems relatively stable, if a little disturbed around the edges, the planet is already, depending on which measure you use, 1.1 to 1.3 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial average. And that doesn't sound like much, but it actually means that we are now warmer than we've ever been in the history of human civilization. And that means that everything that we remember as a species, from the invention of agriculture up through the development of the modern nation state, modern culture, all the rest of it, grew up under climate conditions that are no longer with us. And we are already today in a new climatic regime, which is changing what we can expect from agricultural yields, from wildfire, from droughts, from storms. I mean, the whole litany that everybody at this point is relatively familiar with. We're going to get considerably warmer from here. Probably, I think a best case scenario is just a hair under 2 degrees, although there's still a lot of political leaders around the world who think we have a chance of keeping it to 1.5. And even the difference between that somewhat small seeming, those two somewhat small seeming numbers, 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, is really quite large when it comes to the mathematics of human suffering. So in that half-degree margin, we're talking about expectations that 150 million additional people would die from the effects of air pollution from the burning of the fossil fuels needed to get us to 2 degrees. We're talking about heat waves across South Asia and the Middle East that would be so hot during summer that they would be sort of regularly lethal. You couldn't go outside, or certainly couldn't work outside without, depending on who you are, depending on your biology, some risk of heat stroke and possibly heat death. As a result, most people studying this believe we'd be talking about large-scale climate migration, perhaps the UN says into the hundreds of millions of people. And for all of these reasons, the world that we are heading for and will almost inevitably arrive in our lifetime is really discombobulated and disordered from the one that you and I grew up in. And it scrambles our expectations for the future, perhaps even more. Now, that's not to say that humans are going to go extinct or the planet is going to die or anything of that really apocalyptic extreme, but everything that we know about modern life is the result or grew up under climate conditions which we can't count on any longer. And I think we are learning already just how much of our lives, even in well-developed, prosperous, quote unquote modern parts of the world, are dependent on those climate conditions, and as a result are going to be dramatically disrupted with further warming.
So I think that's a really helpful overview. I think there's sort of two distinctions that people struggle to make in this debate. One is between the most likely scenario on the one side and the sort of tail end risk of the most catastrophic scenarios on the other side. And obviously there's reason to worry about both, but it's important to keep them apart conceptually in our mind. And the other, I think, is between the bad effects that climate change is going to have in itself on the one hand, and whether or not these bad effects are going to make life in the future worse, all things considered, on the other hand, which is not necessarily the same, because if we continue to make economic progress and so on, it may be that those terrible impacts limit the progress, but don't actually make life worse on the whole, which again is something to really worry about, but is important to keep apart conceptually. So perhaps let's go into these two things first. What do you think is the most likely scenario at this point in terms of climate? And I know that depends on political choices. It's really hard to project. But if you have made your best point estimate of where we're going to be in 50 or 100 years, what do you think the climate will look like, and what do you think life on Earth is going to look like? And we'll get to the tail end risks after that.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that all of these projections are governed by several layers of uncertainty. There is uncertainty, as you point out, about human response and human action. There's also uncertainty about how the climate itself will respond, what sorts of feedback loops may be initiated, exactly how quickly things like Arctic ice and Antarctic ice will disappear. So we're making projections in a cloud of deep uncertainty. And for the most part, I think most humans alive on the planet today use that as an excuse to not worry too much about it. But I think the alternate approach that we should be worrying more about it as a result is probably more responsible, at least. Though of course, as a human, I share the other impulse too. If I had to guess, I would say that we're looking at a level of warming this century somewhere between 2 and 2.5 degrees Celsius, maybe a little north of that. And that's basically because we are, making remarkably fast progress driving down the price of renewable energy, which makes it now a good bargain just about everywhere in the world that's investing in its own energy future. But we're not nearly doing enough or moving fast enough to draw down our use of fossil fuel. So at the moment, we're doing much more supplementing of our existing energy base with renewables rather than replacing, which is what we really need to do, because we could have all the renewable energy in the world. But
just let me double click on this point, because I think it's important to draw out. So a lot of the time, the battle against climate change is framed as having to revolve primarily around sacrifices, including economic sacrifices, and there is a part of that which is true. But what you're talking about in terms of affording price of renewable energies is that actually, in many places, it's coming to be just economically rational to deploy technologies that are better for the planet, not because you're interested in saving the planet, but just because they're cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the major shift in the culture of climate change and climate action over the last 5 or 10 years, which is to say, when Al Gore was first warning us about climate change, or when, all these series of the Kyoto Protocol, all of those were undertaken at moments when we really thought that this was going to be a burdensome transition, that we would have to do it for the sake of each other and the planet and our lives in the future, but it was going to be expensive in the short and medium term. And in part because renewable energy costs have fallen so dramatically, and in part because we're getting a clearer sense of especially the health effects of burning fossil fuels, which are really catastrophically large. That calculus has really changed. And just about every political leader everywhere in the world acknowledges that the IEA, the sort of industry standard research group, says that I think the figure is that 90% of the world is now living in places where new renewable energy is cheaper than new fossil fuel energy. And in many parts of the world, we're already seeing it be the case where new renewable capacity is cheaper than continuing to run existing fossil fuel capacity. And that is just a very, very different policy landscape than the one that we were operating in even during the Paris Accord negotiations in 2015. It means that every individual nation can seize this bargain and make better investments rather than worse investments. And that's liberating, not just because it pulls us forward towards more action, but because it liberates individual nations to move on their own. A decade or 2 decades ago, it really was the case that basically nobody was going to move unless we all moved, because we understood that this would be an expensive transition. If it's now the case that we're all going to be economically better off the faster we move, then every individual nation, so long as they get the financial support that they need to sort of jumpstart that transition, can move a little bit more aggressively. And I think we're already starting to see that, not in terms of concrete investments yet, but in terms of the pledges that are being made by nations all around the world, making much more ambitious net zero promises than was considered politically palatable or workable just a half decade ago, in the year or so leading up to the Glasgow summit, where we now have something like, I don't know the exact figure, something like 80% of the world's economy and 80% of carbon emissions are now committed to net zero by 2050, 2060, almost all 2050 with the exception of China.
So this is an amazing example of where technological development, fueled in part by a market economy, fueled in part by government investments, has really transformed the basic conditions we're facing for the better. One thing I've always wondered about this is how far does that get us? Which is to say, that is renewable energy going to get so much cheaper so fast that we will just let a lot of fossil fuel that we have available in the earth lie around? Does it actually get us so far that nations that have a lot of coal reserves or a lot of natural gas reserves are going to say, we just keep those in the ground because it's not actually economically sensible to use them up? Or do you think that we will still need some economic self-sacrifice by nations, some government regulation, etc., to make sure that that happens?
I think it's sort of hard to answer that question in a universal way. I think every country with their own resources, their own energy needs, is sort of approaching that dilemma differently. At a theoretical level, I think that it's certainly possible to imagine renewable prices falling so far that it simply won't make sense to continue to exploit fossil resources. We're not quite at that point. We're mostly talking, in most of the world, it's now the case, as I mentioned earlier, that it may be cheaper to build new renewable capacity than to build new fossil capacity. But if you've got that stuff and you've got you've got those pipelines, you've got those oil wells operating, like, you may as well keep them running. Now, how much farther the price falls and how sort of neatly and linearly we can predict that will continue is a really important factor in the energy transition of the next decade or so. And I think there are good reasons to think that it will continue to fall. In fact, there's a major paper out of Oxford last fall that said that if there was no interference in the market by governments on behalf of fossil fuel entities going forward, that the falling price of renewables alone would be sufficient to bring the world underneath 2 degrees of warming. I'm not sure I buy that analysis entirely, but it's a kind of, as we were saying earlier, it's an illuminating conceptual shift from the place we were in the past. Now, there are petrostates, there are countries whose resources are tied up in fossil fuels, and there are probably many more countries whose tax base is tied up in the fossil fuel industry, the local fossil fuel industry. These are really thorny geopolitical and national political questions. I can't say that the answer is going to be the same for everybody, but I think that we are approaching a point globally where a rational assessment of the, say, 10 to 30 year horizon would be for almost everyone to choose to pour whatever money they're pouring into energy extraction into renewable resources of one kind or another, rather than to invest further in developing new infrastructure. And that's in line with what the IEA has said we need to do to avoid 2 degrees of warming. They say basically, from this point forward, we can't do any new fossil infrastructure at all. Now, inside the fossil fuel industry, they will say, and there's some truth to this, you do need to do some additional infrastructure development to keep supply steady. If you really go to zero tomorrow, it's going to be a bumpy 10 or 15 years. There's probably some wisdom to that, but projects of building new pipelines, exploring for new resources, untapped resources, I think that's probably a really bad idea on multiple levels, because it really will build in a dependency on that. On those fossil fuels for 20, 30 years, maybe 50 years, depending on how the company is doing its planning. And I don't think that there's really a rational, objective model of 50 years from now where we're needing all that fossil fuel energy. And if we're there, we're going to be in some trouble. But it's not, it's also not the case that there's a rational economic path that takes us there. The rational economic analysis says, at least by 2070, 2080, we're going to be talking about a no carbon economy.
So I took us for a little bit of a loop. You were talking about the most likely scenario at this point being something like 2 to 2.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century. I thought it was important to understand why you thought that this comparatively more optimistic scenario is more likely, which has to do with this falling price of renewable energy. What would that mean for what the world would look like? So if in 2100 we're at 2.25 degrees of warming, to take the middle of your estimate, do we know precisely what that would mean in terms of human life and in terms of the environment? What is the kind of range of expectations we should have for what that means for life on the planet?
Before I answer that, can I just go back to something you said just a second ago, which is there are a couple of other factors beyond just the falling price of renewables. Can I just mention them briefly?
Of course.
Yeah. So the falling price of renewables is one really important factor in making a somewhat cooler planet plausible than seemed likely 5 or 10 years ago. But we also have had a real rise in political activism around climate change, which has, along with the market forces, really changed the calculus of our political leaders, and also changed the thinking of a lot of major figures in the corporate world who are focused on a transition, not just for economic reasons, but to serve the sort of social demands of their customers, especially in the global north, where this is becoming a more and more prominent concern. So you see a lot of it is, at the moment empty, but you see a lot of pledges and promises by in the corporate world. And while, personally, I'd prefer not to have to count that as progress, just that empty rhetoric, it is a really marked difference from where we were a few years ago, and does suggest a somewhat different, another driver in addition to the pure price driver. In terms of what we're likely to look at in a world of, say 2.25 or 2.5 degrees of warming, a lot of the things I mentioned a minute ago are relevant. So we're talking about literally 100 or 150, maybe even more deaths from air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels. Today, we're killing about 10 million people a year from the burning of fossil fuels, which is an absolutely catastrophic and almost unimaginable number, although it's also a sign that we can normalize and ignore quite a lot of suffering in the present day, which may tell us a little bit about how we're likely to respond to climate damages in the future. We're talking about...
And the pandemic, I think, has taught us something about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about, many cities across South Asia and the Middle East becoming so hot that the traditional, and by traditional, I don't mean 19th century way of life. I mean, the way that people are living today in those cities, doing a lot of outdoor labor, agricultural labor, doing a lot of commerce in the street in unair conditioned, buildings. All of that is going to become much, much harder. Now, that's not to say that the entire, whatever it is, 12 million people population of Calcutta is going to die on a really hot day, but it does mean that you're going to start to see really high numbers of heat-related illness and death all across the equatorial band of the planet, much more dramatic impacts there than we've ever seen before. And we're likely to see some of those impacts a little more irregularly in the northern latitudes, as we saw with the Pacific heat dome in British Columbia and Washington State last summer. There's likely to be a large, in part as a result, a large migration refugee story this century. I mentioned earlier, the UN says something like 200 million climate refugees is likely by 2050. They actually have a high-end estimate of 1 billion, which seems implausible to me, but nevertheless, I'll just throw it out there as a marker of what maybe a worst-case scenario could be. 1 billion is as many people as live in North and South America combined today.
Can I ask a question here about one thing that I have trouble is thinking through in these scenarios? I think those scenarios seem plausible to me, but the projection is difficult because so many different factors go into it. And certainly, I've been to Calcutta. If the heat becomes more extreme at Calcutta's current level of urban development and current level of socioeconomic development, that would be catastrophic in the ways you outline. Now, but one question, of course, is what will Calcutta look like in the year 2100, which is the year we're talking about in terms of these projections. And it's certainly imaginable that at the current growth trajectory of India, the country will just be vastly, vastly wealthier, and Calcutta will be vastly, vastly wealthier by 2100. Now, that doesn't trivialize, having days in the year where you barely can go outside because it's so hot. It doesn't mean that that's not something to worry about. It doesn't trivialize the ways in which some people may be impacted even then. But it does make it really hard to think in terms of how disruptive it'll be to life as it will look like in Calcutta at that point in any case, to project how many deaths and injuries will result from something like an extreme heat wave. How do you think about that on sort of most likely scenario of what the world will look like in 2100?
Well, I would start by saying, in general, I do think that many of these projections, as you say, do treat human adaptation, resilience, and growth as irrelevant, and that's a problem. These climate impacts are only half of the story, and how we respond and how we grow and how we develop along the way are the other half, and they intersect in very important ways when we're talking about human flourishing. I'm a little less sanguine, I guess, or a little less confident that that we can project recent economic growth, especially in a place like India, forward all the way to 2100 if we're talking about really dramatic climate impacts. And that gets us to a really big theme here, which is that while we are talking about a universal threat, it is global and it will affect every part of the planet, those effects are not equal. They are concentrated in the equatorial bands of the planet, which are also, unfortunately, many of the poorest parts of the world. And there's a lot of good economic work suggesting that certainly with unmitigated warming, which will take us north of the point that we're talking about to 3-4 degrees of warming. But if we follow that trajectory, we can plausibly say that by the year 2100, huge parts of the world will have lost at least half and maybe more than half of their potential for economic growth. That's because their agricultural productivity has fallen dramatically. It's because of the effect of heat and temperature on human cognition and performance, and many other factors beside, in addition to, on top of which we have to think about natural disasters happening somewhat more frequently. Now, I don't want to take any single study or any single bit of research as gospel and say we can take that to the bank and know that if we're at 3 degrees of warming in 2100, that means that all of sub-Saharan Africa will have no economic growth at all. But I just want to call into question this sort of fundamental premise of what you're asking, which is to say that economic growth is continuing almost in parallel to these climate impacts. We know enough about the scale and scope of these impacts to know that they will be, at the very best, in the very best case, complicating our trajectories of economic growth, and in some cases, in some places, probably a lot worse than that. And that, explains, I think, to some degree, some of the geopolitics around climate, where the wealthy countries of the world who are concentrated in literally in the north, we call them the global north, but literally like they're concentrated in the north, are much more comfortable with higher degrees of warming than countries in the global south, who are vulnerable not just because of their level of economic development, but because of their geography and where they are. And you've seen, over the course of the last few years, a sort of a growing chorus of many of these climate diplomats and leaders from sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, calling for much, much higher levels of investment and support from the global north for their efforts to mitigate and adapt, and being really clear that they don't believe that a world of 2 degrees or more warming is really, they would say livable, acceptable, and that it's immoral for anyone anywhere in the world to sort of conscience that level of warming. I think that there is reasonable scientific basis for that perspective. Now, that's not to say that I think at 2.2 degrees, there will be no people living in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, there will be, but the amount of suffering that they will be experiencing is much, much higher than we would like to believe is acceptable to people like us living in the global north. And I think we should try to do what we can to limit that amount of suffering by limiting the amount of warming that they endure, and trying to support them in their efforts of adapting to that new climate. And
there's a double bind here, right? Because I absolutely buy the way in which climate change may make it harder for these countries to develop economically. At the same time, there are also some things that we may ask them to do about climate change that make it harder for them to develop economically. And one of the major reasons why life is very hard in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, or even in parts in India today, is, for example, a poverty of access to electricity and all of the conveniences that come with it, all of the beneficial health effects that come with that. So how do you think we should organize the fight against climate change in such a way that we maximize the chances of countries in the global south developing economically as rapidly as they can, both because that'll actually make them more resilient against the worst effects of climate change, and because it's very important in itself, while at the same time, obviously, making sure that we get onto the best possible pathway in terms of limiting climate change?
Well, I think it gets back to what we were talking about at the start, about the changing economic calculus facing anyone making investments in our energy future anywhere in the world. And that's to say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was really hard to imagine what the global south would do to sort of do their part in limiting global warming, because we knew that those figures are, varied. You probably know better than I do, but somewhere between 800 billion and a billion people who lack regular access to electricity in the world. We can't ask them to continue to have no electricity for the next century. That's not morally acceptable. But giving them electricity, or helping them attain access to electricity today looks like a very, very different bargain than it looked like 5 or 10 years ago, in the sense that it may already be the better choice, the cheaper choice, the sounder investment, to be doing almost all of that, if not all of it, through renewables, and to some degree nuclear. And we'll see how that plays out, especially China's making a big nuclear push, which may change the landscape of nuclear power globally over the next couple of decades, but it sort of remains to be seen. And so my main, it used to be the case that basically we were going to be asking several billion of the world's poorest people to shoulder an economic burden in order to prevent catastrophic warming. And now we're in a situation where, globally speaking, it's really about accelerating a transition that is economically inevitable, based on the forces that we understand today. And there's a real need there for Western support from the global North, from financial institutions, in terms of the sort of initial capital needs of such, building out wind power, building out solar, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a real need there, and we should take seriously the fact that the global North is really failing on that front to this point. They haven't yet even met the promises they made under the Paris Agreement, and it's now the case that leaders from the global South are calling for 7, 8, 12 times as much as they asked for in 2015. But it's not it would not be an ongoing burden that we would be that the sort of fight against climate change would be imposing on the world's poor. In fact, the opposite, especially when you look at the health effects there. I think it's really, really clear. I just wrote a long piece in the LRB about air pollution in particular. And when you look at the state of play there in India, it is really quite gruesome. I mean, the average resident of Delhi has had their life expectancy shortened by 9 years because of air pollution. All across that part of the Indo-Gangetic plain there, you're talking about an average of 6 or more years of life expectancy lost on average. That means that, to the extent that those effects are—
And just to be clear for listeners, so this is because of fine particle pollution, because of just the immediate threat to airways and so on from making your dinner on a coal stove and things like that, or what's the reason here?
There are a lot of different things that cause particulate pollution. So there's the burning of globally, the burning of fossil fuels is the biggest one. But in different parts of the world, the drivers are a little different. So in India, there's also a fair amount of agricultural burning, which is farmers burning their fields. And there's cooking indoors with the kind of unhealthy stoves that you're talking about. And it's not, I mentioned that life expectancy numbers, and globally, it's estimated that we're losing about 10 million people a year, which is, just in my lifetime, it's 400 million lives, just to put that a little bit in perspective. But it's also not the case that these effects are just lethal. They also affect, all kinds of human well-being, down through, causes it has effect on coronary disease, pulmonary disease, it has effect on cognitive performance. There's a relationship with Alzheimer's and dementia, on test scores, and on economic performance, on judgment, umpires who are in refereeing games where there's pollution in the air making worse. It's really like all across the board, no matter what metric you use, air pollution damages your functioning. And India is the sort of worst case situation in the world today, but they're really, really suffering an enormous amount. And, we talked earlier about this, the sort of economic consequences here. And, there's some estimates that India is losing something like 6% of GDP every single year because of air pollution effects. And again, as I said earlier, I don't want to put too much stock in any single study, but the literature about the effects of air pollution on human suffering is so dramatic and so large now. It's I think we have to really look a little more squarely at it when we're thinking about the effects of inaction on climate in particular.
You're right not to put emphasis on one particular study. For I remember one particularly striking one, and you probably know it better than I do. It's been a number of years since I've read it, but I think it's about Salt Lake City or someplace in Utah that used to have some kind of coal plant or something similar. And then one year it shut down, I think, on a temporary basis because of some problems with the factory, or they were rebuilding it or something along those lines. And you just have a number of admissions for asthma to the local hospital from children. and it just plummets in the 1 year, but the factory isn't up and running. I mean, and that, that to me was a very striking sort of natural experiment that really showed the magnitude of some of these effects. So what I hear on that, though, is sort of actually a relatively optimistic story, which is to say that the incentives all seem to point in the same direction. The incentives for government of India in making sure its citizens are healthier, making sure its citizens are more economically productive, and making sure that we deal with climate change seem to go in the same direction.
There's another optimistic part of it too, just to briefly interrupt, which is to say, probably globally, we are past the peak of air pollution, which means that as horrible and catastrophic as those numbers are, they are likely to be declining over the next few decades. And we may be today living with much more death and suffering from air pollution than we will ever again in our lifetimes globally. On top of which, those numbers may well be, I think the argument's pretty strong, may well be higher than the total number of deaths and, or however you want to calculate human suffering from climate change over the rest of the century. So there's a way in which the air pollution story is reassuring when we think about climate change, because we're already, things are already getting better, and they may never get as bad from climate change as they have already been in the past from air pollution, when we, generally speaking, didn't pay all that much attention to it.
That's interesting. So basically, things are actually really terrible right now in ways that are really hard to track, because deaths from air pollution happen in these strange chronic ways, and they're hard to track, and so on and so forth. And they're getting a little bit better, and the effects of climate change are going to be really bad. They're actually not going to be, potentially not as bad as that's a really interesting story. Now let's go for a moment to the most pessimistic side of the argument, which is to say that so far we've been talking about your point estimate, about what you think is sort of the most likely set of outcomes. What motivates me when I think about climate change is the most likely scenario, but to a greater extent, actually the tail end, which is to say that it's once you start thinking about the possible but unlikely outcomes that you get into the real horror scenarios. So take us through what those horror scenarios would look like, and how likely you now estimate them to be.
Well, the high-end warming scenario, this high-end emission scenario that's been built into the scientific literature by the UN's IPCC body is called RCP 8.5. And for a long time, this was often referred to as a business as usual, like we don't do anything trajectory. I think that was always a bit misleading, but it's become even more misleading in the recent past as we've had this renewable price revolution. So I think it's now fair to call it a kind of a worst case scenario that is something like, I don't know, it would require a lot of inaction on the retirement of fossil fuels, and probably some significant additional carbon coming from feedback loops, and some higher degree of what's called climate sensitivity, which is to say, given a certain amount of carbon in the atmosphere, how much warming comes from it, to get to a warming scenario that's suggested by this RCP 8.5 emission scenario. But there has been a lot of talk. I've written about how this is now looking much less likely. A lot of other people have written about it too. I would just say in general, that's an emissions path, but we can also get to that level of warming from other mixes of effects. It's not just, if RCP 8.5 assumes something like a 6-fold increase of coal use this century. I don't think that's plausible, but we could get to that same level of warming if we had worse feedbacks than we expected, and the global climate sensitivity was considerably higher. And that's not a discountable probability. Now, I wouldn't put it at like our median 50% probability at all, but if it's something like a 10% chance, that's really meaningful enough to worry about, especially given how catastrophic the impacts would be. And they would be, they're estimates that suggest that, we're talking about a tripling of global warfare because of the effect of temperature on conflict. And there's studies about how that affects conflict at the individual level too, not just at the social level. We're talking about agricultural yields falling by 50% or more. Again, barring adaptation and innovation on the sort of GMO crop side or agricultural strategy side. We'd be talking about, places on the planet that could be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. Hurricanes, wildfire, drought, you go down the list and it gets pretty bleak, which could produce, all told, something like, some studies have suggested as much as $600 trillion in global climate damages by the end of the century, which is considerably more wealth than exists in the world today. Now, presumably we'd be richer then, so it wouldn't be more than exists in the world then, but still it's an unbelievably large impact. And at that level of warming, I don't think that we're talking about global civilizational collapse, even at 4 degrees, but it starts to seem like those risks are real and worth worrying about, even if they're not likely. And certainly at a local level, we're likely to see much more conflict, especially across the parts of the world that we were talking about earlier, the global south, that have much less capacity for and resources for building resilience and adaptation, and are as a result much more prone to at least sort of fraying of the public order, and maybe worse. And that is, as I said, I would put that level of warming. It's hard to put numbers on this. One of the things I've been thinking more and more about over the last few years is just how much our sense of the future is clouded by uncertainty, and how difficult a time we have thinking through those problems. But if you do want to put an arbitrary number on it, say something like 5 or 10% that we're going to get 4 degrees of warming, that really is a dramatically different world than the one that we have always known. And at the very least, living in it will require a pretty thorough remodeling of expectations and response, such that we are preoccupied in a quite profound central way, in an ongoing way, about how to engineer livable futures in that landscape. That's not to say it can't be done. I would, as I said earlier, like I think that at 4 degrees, there will be large parts of the world that are operating and kind of familiar seeming, and maybe even wealthier. But nevertheless, like the basic, board game that we're operating in is going to be very different at that future, and we're talking about the lives of billions of people who will be really dramatically affected.
So the picture I get from this conversation, which I found super clarifying and helpful, is that there's parts of the world that are already very affluent. There's parts of the world that are very poor today and suffer in important ways, including a lack of access to electricity because of their poverty. We actually have a real crisis, a health crisis at the moment, because of particulate pollution and so on. And then there's this danger of climate change, which on the most likely scenario is a very significant danger, on a less likely scenario is a catastrophic danger. What sort of policies do you think we should adopt to maximize human well-being over the next decades? How do we deal with this complex of different challenges we're facing in a way that is as equal as possible to all of them?
Well, I think, at a macro prescriptive level, all of the incentives line up, at least by my judgment. So renewable energy is already cheaper than dirty energy in most parts of the world. In short order, it'll be a better bet everywhere. The public health benefits of making that transition are enormous, and they will allow us to avert the most catastrophic impacts of climate change if we undertake that transition very aggressively. And even if we undertake it lackadaisically, probably the pace of technological change will allow us to avoid some of those worst case scenarios. That means that, the answer is, the prescription is pretty clear to me. It's just like, we got to make this transition fast. And one of the reasons we want to make it fast is because it'll limit the amount of time in which the bumpiness of the transition is problematic. And at the moment, we don't have renewable capacity sufficient that if we turn off all our nuclear reactors or turn off all of our coal power plants, that it's not just people in sub-Saharan Africa who aren't going to have energy, it's people like you and me aren't going to have energy either. And that's not acceptable. So we need some time to sort of build out our capacity while we draw down our fossil fuel use. But if we do that over the course of 30 or 40 years, as opposed to 10 or 15 years, there's just going to be considerably more sort of geopolitical and energy complications that arise from it. And so I think for all of these reasons, it's like the goal is moving fast, moving most aggressively. Now, in terms of policy prescriptions, how we do that, in general, I think it's hard to talk in universal terms. Every country has different needs, and every country has different demands and political dynamics. But even looking at the very explicit subsidies that we are giving out today to the fossil fuel business in much of the world, the IMF says they use a more expansive definition of subsidy, which includes also unpaid for damages, which is probably a little misleading, but they say that we're paying something like $5 or $6 trillion a year in subsidies to the fossil fuel business. A more conservative estimate of direct subsidies is still in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And there's really no justification for that at all, so far as I see. I think that that's quite poisonous, literally poisonous, and poisonous politically too. I think that what we want to be doing is not waiting for next generation technologies, but building out as aggressively as we possibly can the tools that we have today, while putting some amount of money in that R&D so that 30, 40 years from now, as we're solving the last bits of the problem, we have new tools available. But I think we can't really wait for that development to take place, because every year that we delay, we put more carbon into the atmosphere. And I think one really deeply underappreciated feature of climate change is that carbon is cumulative. It hangs in the atmosphere at least for centuries and possibly millennia, which means that every ounce of carbon that's ever been emitted in the history of industrialization is still up there, or an equivalent bit of carbon that there's a transfer. It's complicated to explain, but basically if you put an ounce of carbon, there will be an ounce of carbon that you're responsible up there for many centuries. So if you burned a piece of coal in Manchester in the 19th century, that is still having global warming effects that are equal to a piece of coal that's being burned today in China. And we don't get to draw down that carbon naturally on any timescale it makes sense to plan for. Over the course of millions of years, we will reduce that carbon. We may be able to accelerate that with some technological tools, which I'm relatively bullish on. But in general, anything that we do today is just adding to the total of warming. And so delay is really terrible. We are currently at essentially peak emissions for, we're emitting more now than we've ever emitted in all of human history, which means that we are just making the problem worse and worse every year. We talk a lot about the next few decades in a much more optimistic way. I think there are good reasons for that, but we haven't begun yet to bend the curve downward. And we don't just need to reduce our emissions, we need to get them all the way to zero to stabilize the planet's climate at any temperature level. So we have a huge, huge task ahead of us. And every year that we delay, we are making the mountain taller, which means the descent will have to be sharper. There's a really eye-opening graphic that I think about a lot. There's one version that's like global emissions flagged with each of the climate conferences. And basically there's been no effect of any of the climate conferences on emissions, which have continued to go up and up. And as I sort of famously wrote about in my book, half of all global emissions have come in the last 25 years. So we've done more damage since this became an international, top shelf concern than in all the centuries before. That's kind of damning. But maybe even more alarming is a graph that shows if we implement all of the policies that were pledged at Paris and after, but no more, that would actually, we would entirely exhaust our carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius sometime in the middle of the next decade. So, we have a very short course here, and every single year that we delay is just making the path to a quote unquote stable climate much, 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 much harder to achieve. It's not just about moving in the right direction. At this point, we have to move much, much, much faster. And looking historically,
So what would that mean concretely? Because you talked about phasing out subsidies or abolishing quickly or immediately subsidies for fossil fuel companies. That seems obviously right. But you also talked about, we want to move into these cleaner energy technologies over the next 10 or 15 years rather than the next 20 or 30 years. What would that look like? Is that, are you making that argument to the CEOs of Shell? Is that the audience? Are you making that argument to policymakers? If so, what can they do to make the transition? Are you making that argument to individual listeners of this podcast? Should they change sort of who is delivering electricity to them in the household? What would it mean for us collectively to make this transition in the next 10 years rather than the next 35 years?
I think it's a question that will be resolved at the national political level primarily. The fossil fuel companies, some of them are moving a little bit more quickly than others, but none of them are really moving at the speed that climate science would require of them. And I think ultimately, if you fast forward to the end game where we're at a zero carbon situation, we're not burning any fossil fuels at all. And unless those companies are going to transform entirely into clean energy companies, which I don't think they will, we have to really think about basically retiring them, drawing them down in one way or another. Now, how that is achieved is a matter for different national governments to strategize around. But in general, I think that they need to play a role in a lot of the infrastructural build out that is beyond the capacity of individual companies. So we're talking about a much cleaner grid, for instance, much more renewable charging stations on highways, to make this rapid transition possible. But the obstacles are many fewer than seemed to be the case just a few years ago. And I mentioned earlier this paper out of Oxford that came out in the fall, and this guy just modeled it's a team of people modeled the learning curves of renewable energy of I think wind, solar, hydro, at least, and really found that the only thing standing in the way here is a real takeover of the energy system by renewables is political interference. It's not that there doesn't need to be additional R&D. There doesn't need to be even any more incentive, structure to make people prefer that path when they're buying their own energy, or to make it more a sounder investment for people investing in that energy. It's really just about getting out of the way. Now, as I said earlier, I think that may be a little optimistic. I personally would like to see, if we're subsidizing the fossil fuel business by hundreds of billions of dollars a year, I'd rather see that turned into the renewable side of things rather than just eliminated. But I don't think that the policy prescription at a macro level is all that tricky. It's like we have political economies all around the world that have been essentially captured by fossil fuel businesses for a century, and in part that was productive and useful. It made us a lot richer and a lot happier, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to break up that marriage, and we need to really use the forces of government spending to accelerate the transition that is unfolding already, as we see, but not unfolding rapidly enough to avoid some quite scary outcomes. And when we look at the last decade or two, several of the main reasons why we have such impressive renewable prices is because of the spending that was put into the Recovery Act in the Obama administration, because of spending that was undertaken in Germany in the previous decade, and because of spending that's been and R&D spending that's been undertaken in China over the last decade in particular. This is, it's not a mystery. It's like you put money into this stuff, technological progress follows, and the prices fall, which makes it a much more attractive proposition for consumers, especially, and governments planning their own future. So, yeah, I mean, it's for me, it's sort of all a no-brainer if you're planning this at a whiteboard. The problem is, we don't live on whiteboards, and even the short-term turbulence that comes with transitions can be quite politically uncomfortable, especially when governments are operating on 2 or 4 year time horizons, as they often are.
This has been a wonderful overview of a situation we're facing. Just to sort of round off the conversation, I want to think a little bit about how to communicate this and how it often is communicated. I'm struck by the fact that you are one of the most well-known journalists about this, one of the most influential voices about this. But the impression you get, or I got from talking to you, for 50 minutes, is quite different from what a lot of a consensus about climate change sounds like in the newspapers. I don't think, there's no distance, I don't think, between the consensus in the scientific literature and the way you're talking about this. But there is, I think, a real disjunction between what this sounds like if you read New York Magazine, the place which you write, or The Guardian, or the New York Times, and the subtlety in this conversation. And often the public conversation, it does sound like the world is going to end in 10 or 15 years, and we're on the way towards, complete doom. And we basically have to radically change everything in order to deal with climate change. That we have to abolish capitalism, that we have to be much poorer, that we have to make very significant sacrifices at the individual and the collective level. And all of that sounds sort of significantly different from how you've been outlining the situation for the last 15 minutes. So, what do you think about the prominence and the usefulness of this sort of catastrophist frame, and what explains its prominence in the discourse?
Well, in general, putting aside climate for a brief minute, on any political issue, you have a wide spectrum of perspectives, and the value of an extreme perspective is not necessarily its applicability or its wisdom or lack of wisdom as it applies to somebody who's more in the middle of the spectrum. There are a lot of different kinds of political rhetoric that are useful and powerful, and can be complementary even if they are somewhat divergent. The UN's IPCC climate change body, in looking at their landmark 1.5 degree report of 2018, they were looking at the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And they described that gulf as enormous as it applies to human flourishing and human suffering. 2 degrees of warming has long been called a catastrophic level of warming. Now, you use the word catastrophist framing. The science tells us that we will be living in a very, very different world, which will be much harder for us, putting aside all the other things that we've talked about, at 2 degrees, then at 1.5 degrees, then at 1 degree, then at 0.5 degrees. And this UN body, which is not by its nature an alarmist organ, they are, I think, by most metrics compared to the science that they're processing, pretty conservative actually, said that in order to avoid 2 degrees of warming, we needed a World War II scale mobilization towards renewable energy starting in 2019. This is not Greta Thunberg talking, and it's not, Extinction Rebellion or Sunrise talking. This is the world scientists convened by the United Nations. Now, those people may have their own alarmist inclinations, but in general, I think it is a sober, and as I said a minute ago, relatively conservative digest of the scientific literature as it exists. I don't think that framing is wrong. I think that it's right. It may just be also partial in that it overlooks some of the other lines of development that we've been talking about, adaptation, resilience, modification, and all the rest of it. But if we hope to avoid 2 degrees of warming, we have to do much, 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 much more than is being done today. It's one reason why I don't think that's very likely. And if you set your standard of success as staying below 2 degrees of warming, then we are already today very much on the brink of failure. And that is really important to keep in mind. When I talk about how some of the worst case scenarios are now looking less likely, that's important to keep in mind too. But it doesn't mean that the likely future is what would have seemed to a climate scientist 20 or 30 years ago an acceptable outcome. It is still beyond the pale of that worldview. And I think we will find ways to live and indeed to some degree flourish there, but it's going to be a much more challenging path ahead. Now, the question of rhetorical approach, what's valuable, what's useful, I think one reason why we have sort of bent our curve of expectation, if not yet our curve of emission, is that more and more people are more and more worried about the medium-term future when it comes to climate. I do think that the climate protests and the language of activists and indeed alarmists over the past few years have been one of the driving factors in making, say, every global leader get up on stage in Glasgow and say, this is an existential emergency. We need to get to zero by 2050 or 2060. Those were not promises that anyone was contemplating making in Paris just 5 years before. And I think part of that is because we have a newly aggressive, newly visible sort of vanguard flank of the climate movement. For 30, 40 years, they were climate activists and nobody listened to them. And for 5 years, we've had Greta and XR and Sunrise and the climate strikers. And the global rhetoric around climate change has really changed as a result. It's why every CEO of every Fortune 500 company is talking about climate responsibility, even if they're not yet moving quickly enough on it. So I think it's played a very important and useful role and has literally changed the likely future of the planet as a result, because many more people are taking this much more seriously than they were 5 or 6 years ago. That's a separate question from what kind of rhetoric we need now, given the changing landscape and the changing dynamic. And personally, as someone who has been an avowed alarmist in the past, I think that we are in a somewhat different place with different rhetorical needs now than we were, say, 5 or 6 years ago. In part because, at least at the rhetorical level, there has been this great awakening. And even though many leaders of all sectors are falling short of what the science says is necessary to avoid what we've long understood as really dramatic warming, possibly catastrophic warming, it is still the case, and importantly the case, that we are talking about it. There are almost no climate deniers, Jair Bolsonaro aside, in any position of power anywhere in the world. That is a really major shift. When countries are making their, energy plans on decadal timescales now, they are focused on getting to zero. I think they're not yet focused enough when they're making them on like the 5 or 10 year timeline, but nevertheless, there's been a real shift there. And as a result, I think that the rhetorical need is less for waking people up and more for, sorting out what this future will look like and how to maximize human flourishing in the context of significant and possibly, and certainly dangerous and possibly catastrophic warming. I think that's one of the reasons why you've seen some of these extremist groups and figures sort of lose some of their prominence over the last year or two. So, Greta is still a major figure. The climate strikers are still doing their thing, but XR is a shell of its former self. Sunrise in the US is much less influential than it was in 2018 and 2019. And I think that reflects a kind of collective strategic wisdom, which is the chief job here now is less about making people understand that the world is changing in dramatic ways, which will threaten their livelihoods and the livelihood of their children if we don't take action, and more about making sure the transition that is underway moves faster and with as little disruption as we possibly can. And as a result, I think we're in a sort of different rhetorical place than we were a few years ago. But I would challenge some of what you presented as the sort of premise of your question, which is, and maybe there's a difference between us and our rhetorical position on or intellectual position on this set of issues. But when I read the New York Times, I don't see alarmism. And there's some of it that we publish that I've published under my name, of course. The Guardian does a bit more of it. But when I read those, I don't think that journalism is misleading or irresponsible. In the same way that I might describe some statements by Extinction Rebellion or whatever as misleading or irresponsible. I think that the world scientists have said pretty unequivocally that we've already lost the opportunity to avoid serious and significant damages from climate change. We are in a place now where we're strategizing about how to minimize those losses and impacts rather than avoid them, and that doing so requires a much faster transition than most of our polities and much of our politics has ever really tolerated in the past. So we're in a.
So I thought we were nearly ending on a point of agreement, but let's go into the disagreement if you like. Look, I think the New York Times and New York Magazine are complicated places with a lot of different articles. part of the problem is that the most alarmist pieces or headlines travel the most in social media. So 9 out of 10 articles can be perfectly reasonable and accurate. And the 1 out of 10 that's a little bit misleading, maybe the one that actually gets the most eyeballs and people may be most aware of. But just to give 2 examples, right? One is, I remember a study showing a very worrying finding that by 2100, a significant percentage of the territory of New York City may come to be significantly affected by floods or maybe underwater. But as I recall, it was about 7% of the territory of New York City, and it was mostly the least inhabited parts of New York City and Red Hook and other parts of it. Now that's terrible, something to be very worried about. But by the time that this became a magazine cover, it had, you know, a photoshopped, or however you want to call it, photograph of Manhattan with the Empire State Building, you know, 10 floors underwater. Now that is just not what the study showed at all, right? It suggests a completely different future from what the science that's underlying suggested. You know, and the other example, I know that the evidence has changed, the reality has changed over the last years, is that, you know, if people recall, you know, if people listen to this conversation with you, they will come away with a very different impression of what's going on in the world than they will if they only know the title of your book, which is The Uninhabitable Earth. Now, we all want to find titles of books that are nice and punchy, and, you know, I don't mean to make this person completely understand, but that perhaps also is just a symbol of how easy it is to have a disjuncture between, you know, the subtle, deeply informed thoughts of journalists working in this field and the sort of public impression that their work may give because of the nature of how media works, book sales work, social media works, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complicated set of issues to navigate. You know, my on the particular question of the title of my book, I mean, you know, I think of this as being in the tradition of, you know, Silent Spring and The End of Nature, neither of which were meant to be taken literally. I think titles are often hyperbolic and smart readers understand that. But it is the case that given unmitigated warming, we're talking about large parts of the world that will look a lot more like the Sahel than they will look like, you know, whatever, Austria. And that is a really meaningful change, which I think we should all be worried about. The thing that I would say as a sort of as a rhetorical point, separate from the factual point, is we, all of us, live our lives anchored in the present day, and our expectations for the future are built from those impressions, which means that it is quite easy to look past some warnings of change and treat them as considerably more marginal than they really are, because we are so used to the life that we live in, the world that we live in. And it may be the case that at 2 or 2.5 degrees, even with all of the impacts that we know will happen coming to pass, there will still be people in parts of the world who look around and say, like, what were these scientists warning us about? Everything's fine. But that will be because we have normalized, you know, a tripling of California wildfires, or you know, some dramatic rise in the level of days with lethal heat, you know, across India, or pick your climate impact. And our ability to normalize that suffering, I think, is not really an argument against taking seriously the threat of it evolving. And I think here, you mentioned briefly earlier the experience in the pandemic, and I think that that's illustrative in the sense that, you know, speaking of journalistic choices, I mean, the New York Times published a huge banner headline across its front page when 100,000 Americans had died of COVID. It listed the names of the dead. It was a major, you know, journalistic choice and event that they, you know, got behind. We're now at basically 10 times that level. And we have begun to, in much of the country, and maybe even most notably in places read by New York, you know, where the New York Times is read, started to treat that as more like background noise. Now, I don't want to say that the first choice was purely moral and virtuous and correct, and the set of choices that we're making now is totally immoral and a force of denial and a measure of our inhumanity to one another. But it shows you just how differently we relate to different sorts of threats and how much we can choose to emphasize or de-emphasize things that we know will cause human suffering. It's a large planet. There are a lot of people on it. 100 years from now, that'll still be the case. But that doesn't mean that the climate suffering of the people who will be impacted is irrelevant. And I think we should, try to be as focused on what we can do to alleviate that suffering as we possibly can. And I think for a long time that meant really trying to raise alarm about climate change and global warming. I still think the world is not alarmed enough. I think that in general, we are far too complacent and far too trusting that our institutions will endure, that the promises that we were handed, you and I growing up at the end of the 20th century in parts of the wealthy West, those promises are, they're not gone, but they've been called into question, not just by climate change, but by other forces. And that's bad. And we shouldn't be afraid to say that's bad just because it may not mean the true end of the world. There's a sort of famous quip about climate science that like the two unlikeliest outcomes are the world's going to end or it'll all be fine. We are in the middle, in the muck, in the shit of it. And, if what it takes is being really focused on future suffering to turn the dial a little bit down from 2.5 degrees to 2.2 degrees, I certainly think the science justifies it, but I also think it's rhetorically useful to do that, to shake us out of our intuitive complacency and make us understand how much of what we take for granted or have taken for granted in the recent past is at least uncertain and maybe worse than that going forward.
David Wallace-Wells, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to talk.